The days of wishful thinking to go back to the combined sense of unity in the Ogdensburg Agreement are gone. There are fundamental changes going on in U.S. political culture, civic culture. What is happening in the U.S. is fundamentally a longer-term change than only one president.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, Tuesday, July 8th, 2025.
This is a moment for Europe, and we are ready to step up. This set of proposals focuses on how to use all the financial levers at our disposal in order to help member states to increase expenditures in defense capabilities. Rearm Europe could mobilize close to 800 billion euros for a safe and resilient
Europe. New era of cooperation. Our strategic Canada-EU or EU-Canada strategic partnership for the future will build a new and deeper relationship that brings us closer together from defense to digital, from supply chains to security. We're launching comprehensive negotiations across multiple areas of cooperation and connection, trade, security, digital, climate. And this will make us both more resilient and more prosperous.
Spain has been notorious for low pay. You know who else was a low payer, just about the lowest? A place called Canada. Because Canada said, why should we pay when the United States will protect us free?
In Brussels last week, ahead of the 76th NATO Summit in The Hague, Canada and the EU signed the Security and Defense Partnership, a foundational step in a broader agreement dubbed the EU-Canada Strategic Partnership of the Future. The deal is intended to pave the way for closer integration in defense, trade, climate action, digital innovation, while positioning Canada to join the EU's Rearm Europe initiative and its SAFE program, which hopefully opens the door to major procurement and industrial opportunities. At a time of mounting global uncertainty and shifting U.S. foreign policy signals, this agreement is meant to reflect Canada's effort to strengthen ties with like-minded democratic partners, diversify its defense posture, and lay the groundwork for deeper industrial and strategic integration with Europe without abandoning its core security relationship with the United States. Here today to discuss the agreement, Canada's efforts to pivot closer to Europe, Readiness 2030 and the Rearm Europe initiative, we're joined by Wendy Gilmour, Bernd Althusman, Sven Biscop, Rafael Loss, and Jean-Pierre Maulny. First, we'll turn to Wendy Gilmour, CDAI Vice Chair and former Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment for NATO. Now, everyone is talking about the NATO Summit that just happened and the 5% benchmark, which was probably the biggest piece of news to come out of the summit. But a few things happened the day before the summit as well. The EU summit with Canada, where we signed a defense agreement with the EU. And this comes after many months of discussing the prospects of Canada and the EU strengthening trade and their defense integration. So kind of broadly, I'm wondering what you think the EU-Canada Security and Defense Partnership signals about Canada's potentially evolving role in European defense architecture and about the relationship more broadly.
I think it's a really important development. What's interesting about the agreement that was signed, the Security and Defense Partnership Agreement, is that in reality, a vast part of the agreement simply reinforces work that was already underway. It brings together a number of different initiatives that were scattered across the full ecosystem of Canada-EU activities, and it puts it in one comprehensive document. And why that's important is because the EU is it's a complicated organization. You have, of course, the Commission, the Council, all of the interests of the different member states. And by having one framework agreement, it allows for a series of activities to take place that are then considered to be truly blessed by the Commission and the Council and give structure to our engagement.
How do you see Canada continuing to balance this relationship as well as balancing the bilateral relationship we have with the United States? There's been some contradictory messaging, and I suppose that's because it's a very complicated matter. But, on one hand, we're talking about aligning ourselves with things like the Golden Dome Initiative. On the other hand, questioning whether we should purchase the F-35s and sort of try to diversify away from the U.S. towards Europe. So how do you see Canada juggling this dynamic?
I think first and foremost, it's I was sort of laughing and things. It's our relationships with other countries are not like a pie, which we have to then divide up. And if you have one larger piece for one country, you have a smaller piece for another country. It's a little bit like maybe parents would look at, if you have another child, do you love your other children any less? It's not like that at all. What is important for Canada is that we must have a diversity of relationships that allow us to pursue interests on a number of different levels. There is no doubt that the security of North America is always going to be dominated by our relationship with the United States. That's the reality of geography. If we are looking at securing our own homeland, that undefended border, the longest in the world, is going to be ultimately what we pay particular attention to. If we're looking at international peace and security, which is directly relevant also to Canada's peace and security, then we look at where are the other relationships we need to have. And we have had a long-standing relationship with Europe, not the least of which is the two founding nations of settlers that arrived in Canada, but also our engagement with other Western democracies which share our values, which also are interested in adhering to and promoting international rule of law. And that's critical to our understanding of how we're going to remain prosperous, safe, and frankly continuing to advance Canadian interests. So the EU relationship it doesn't detract in any way from the Canada-US relationship, but it gives us a whole lot more options, and frankly is an important avenue to explore as well. It's not good for any activity to have all your eggs in one basket. And Canada hasn't really, we've always, since its inception, we've been part of NATO. We are a NATO founding member, but we cannot be too reliant on the US as the first place we look for everything, frankly, because they are increasingly not clear what they want out of their own international relationships. And by conducting an economic war against Canada and others, it's very clear that we need that diversity. But it isn't to say that we're going to pursue an EU relationship at the expense of our relationship with the US. They're just two very different beasts.
It's been kind of a background to our brief discussion we're having here, but I'm wondering if you can reflect on maybe what some of your key takeaways were from the summit, maybe particularly in terms of the health of the transatlantic relationship vis-a-vis the Americans and the alliance more broadly, as well as maybe some of the challenges and opportunities inherent in Canada reaching both 2% by the end of the fiscal year and then that big 5% target now within a decade.
Yeah, I mean, there were two summits back to back. There was the CanadaUS Summit, and then of course there was the NATO Summit. So I'll maybe start with the NATO Summit. It was very clear that the underlying, if not overt, objective of the most recent summit, NATO Summit in The Hague, was making sure that the U.S. remained committed to the Washington Treaty, to particularly Article 5 collective defense, that the U.S. was going to come to the table and not carry out any actions that would in any way further disrupt the unity or the understanding of what it means to be in a collective defense alliance. And so the fact that Article 5 was reconfirmed in the summit declaration, first and foremost, was critical. Secondly, the fact that all of the nations of NATO, particularly those that are not the United States, so the European and members and Canada, have realized that we need to play a greater part in our own defense. And so the frantic efforts to try and reach 2% in year by Canada and a few other NATO nations are critical in that respect. And then accepting that the 2% was always, right back to the Vilnius summit in 2023, 2% was a floor, not a ceiling. And so we've moved that floor, at least the aspiration of the floor, to 3.5% for direct military expenditures. And that's recognizing that for NATO to have credible deterrence and defense, all of the nations in NATO need to, number one, reassure themselves or rearm to the extent of to ensure their own domestic security, which is Article 3 of the treaty, very important that nations are responsible for their own defense before looking collectively. And then secondly, coming to the table with the collective defense capabilities that are needed to present an alliance cohesive whole. And that's, frankly, if if the uncertainty in behavior from the U.S. is what got us there, it's not ideal because we would like to have a more predictable international environment, but that's what has got us to this point. And frankly, adding the 1.5% for dual use and resilience related infrastructure is key for Canada and for Europe. So that's really positive.
With the Americans and with President Trump and some of the disruptions that this administration has ushered in, I suppose, do you see this as maybe a waiting game? Like once Donald Trump is out of office, the relations might go back to normal, or as they were, or do you see this as a longer term disruption and something that needs to be kind of worked around among Canada and some of the other NATO allies? Like is it there seems to be kind of conflicting interpretations here. Do these pivots in American foreign policy we're seeing kind of emanate from Trump himself, or are there broader currents within the general political culture? So I guess I'm asking more simply, in the longer terms, can we continue to hedge along with the Americans?
The days of wishful thinking to go back to the combined sense of unity in the Ogdensburg Agreement are gone. There is, my personal view, there are fundamental changes going on in U.S. political culture, civic culture. They pose a danger to themselves before it is that they look internationally. And it's, was it Robin Williams said that being in Canada is like living in an apartment over top of a meth house? I may be paraphrasing him. I'm hoping it never gets that bad, but there is certainly an element of what is happening in the U.S. is fundamentally a longer term change than only one president. He is a symptom, not the cause, in my view. So what does that mean for Canada? We have to have a resilient and robust economy that is, capitalizes on the 40 million plus Canadians that we have right now. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as a small population. We are not anymore. 40 million plus people is a big population. We happen to have a very large territory, but that doesn't change the fact that we are, we have human resources, physical resources, a wealth of geography, 3 oceans that make us, make us realize that we're in a position to do a lot more for ourselves and to lead internationally in our own interest. I think it comes down to, so we need to friendshore. We need to look for like-minded nations that also understand that the world is a better place if we have a predictable, rules-based international order. And the EU is still, vast majority of nations in the EU, but collectively the EU as a policy still believe that as well. And so that's why the EU summit that happened before NATO, EU-Canada Summit, is so tremendously important. It's not a hedge your bet. It's frankly leveraging all of our partnerships, including those in the Indo-Pacific, that can help us assure our own security and prosperity. But that work starts at home first.
Oh, Wendy, thanks for joining me to provide some commentary on these 2 summits in the big week that we just had, which was also preceded, I'll remind our listeners, with a big defense announcement from Canada on our defense spending. With that, all this said, Wendy, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with, or if there's maybe something we didn't cover that you think might be important to speak to quickly.
Yeah, I think what I am looking for going forward is how not just the Canadian government, which is responsible for establishing the framework for us to leverage all of these different partnerships, but how Canadian industry and frankly Canadian people, but specifically our exporters, our industrial leaders, our services network, how they take advantage of these frameworks that are being established. The comprehensive economic and trade agreement with the EU that was signed a decade ago, actually a little bit less than a decade ago, but now has been provisionally in place for a number of years, has increased, as my understanding, 65% two-way trade between Canada and Europe. we need to build on that and move it forward. The Security and Defense Partnership Agreement that was just signed will allow for collaborative efforts between Canada and the EU and Canadian industry and European industry to move forward in areas of technology development, capability development that we both really need. I would really like to see everybody stepping up to the plate to pursue those opportunities and not simply bemoaning the fact that, and I'm not saying that, that sounds overly negative, but it was easy to work with the United States because of long-standing trade pathways and agreements. It's going to be a little bit more uncomfortable to look beyond that, and we need to leverage these new pathways and continue to move out beyond simply a Northwest trade relationship.
Now we'll turn to Bernd Althusman, head of the CAS office in Canada, and former Minister of Education and State Secretary in Lower Saxony, Germany from 2009 to 2013. Bernd will speak with us about strengthening EU-Canada cooperation and Canada's place in Rearm Europe. What role do you see for Canada in the Rearm Europe agenda and the Readiness 2030 goals as Europe ramps up defense industrial capacity? And how can Canadian firms collaborate or further integrate their defense industrial bases?
Canada, while not a member of the European Union, remains a key transatlantic partner with NATO, included in Horizon Europe as a partner and observer in the Council of European Space Agency, and a close ally in defending democratic values and collective security. As Europe advances its Rearm Europe agenda and pursues Readiness 2030 goals, and my hope is that Readiness 2030 is not too late, to be honest, Canada's role can be strategic, industrial, and diplomatic. By aligning Canadian capability development, for example, procurement of new fighters, ISR systems, naval assets, and so on, with EU-NATO interoperability standards, Canada supports the same goals targeted by Rearm and Readiness 2030. Also, Canada stands out as the only North American partner left that EU still is open to partner and collaborate in the soon future. Other collaborations such as Diana's presence in Halifax and bilateral defense MOUs and other agreements with the EU member states would also be highly encouraged. I think that is maybe the framework for the role of Canada working in together with Rearm Europe. It's necessary to use the options which are made with this Rearm Europe, and it's officially said from Prime Minister Maulny and from the President of the European Commission, Ms. Ursula von der Leyen, that it's really needed that we now work on the same field. Let me quote Ms. Ursula von der Leyen in this year. She said, "Europe and Canada are trusted friends and partners. Today, this relationship is more critical than ever. I look forward," she said, "to working with you to defend democracy, free and fair trade, our shared values." I think these very important words to the swearing in of Maulny, said from Ms. von der Leyen, that is not only a sad word, she means it as she said. And therefore, the role of Canada for the European Union and for Rearm Europe and for NATO is of highest importance for a common future. A big and developed country as Canada, aiming to reach NATO's 2% defense spending aim per GDP, seems maybe quite late. Many allies are targeting currently 5%, but as I said in the beginning, at the end it's not the percentage. At the end is who is able to do what, who has the capacity to fill gaps in the common defense. For example, looking to the Arctic, the northern flank of NATO, one of the pillars to defend the northern flank of NATO are the Nordic states and Canada, together with Iceland, Denmark, Greenland, belonging to Denmark, and the Nordic states in Europe. That is our common aim. And therefore, Canada is currently undertaking many efforts to fulfill this 2% goal, but also to do more in the future. I think so. And it's not the discussion about this percentage goals from my point of view, but it's only my point of view. Others say we have to be aware that every member of NATO and European Union is willing to do what they can. Nevertheless, as we repeated earlier, there are many fields for joint capability development and ammunition. And munitions production can be worked in bilaterally on both parts of the continent, in Europe and in Canada as well. Different companies such as Hensoldt, for example, or Germany's Rheinmetall or Quantum, they are investing in North American's munitions capacity. This can involve into co-located production of NATO standard munitions, critical for both nations' stockpiles. Canadian public-private co-investment in Rheinmetall or similar joint ventures to boost 155 millimeter artillery shell production. I would also agree that both Germany and Canada can share overlapping modernization efforts in air defense, counter systems, mobile artillery, and munitions resupply, cyber defense, digital battlefield integration, Arctic-capable platforms. That is all what we can do together, and Canada will play an important role from the view of Germany as well, supporting new startups between two countries. Especially in the south of Germany, we have interesting startups in the drone sector. AI and drones. The future of defense is a common issue for us, where Germany and Canada looks to each other what is possible to do to defend our countries, to defend in case of attacks, to defend common together the European Union and the NATO allies. I think that is what we have to look now and care for, to care for a common production basis. My hope is that everyone is aware of the situation we are in the moment living in. It's not alarmism. Looking to the Arctic, the activities of Russia and China in the Arctic, looking to the Malacca Straits, the streets before Taiwan, China and between the sea routes between China and Taiwan, looking to Iran and Israel conflict in the moment, looking to the warfare against the Ukraine, means we as members and living in the Western free world have to stand up for our democracy and have to stand and to defend our way of living and democracy, peace and freedom. And nothing is for granted. Peace is not for granted. Freedom is not for granted. And security is not for granted. And maybe we have in the last 10, 20 years looked much more to the US to defend Europe in case of attackings. But the US has now another government, a new US president, and his main points looking maybe more to the Indo-Pacific and China. But that means for Europe, but also with the assistance of Canada and in good partnership with Canada, means that we have also the responsibility for our countries to be prepared to defend in case of attacking. Therefore, NATO and the European Union are standing strong together, and Rearm Europe is the signal to the cringe states, to the autocracies of the world, that we are ready
We spoke with Dr. Sven Biscop, the director of the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, about what's driving the Rearm initiative, as well as some of the challenges of implementing it. Dr. Biscop, could you explain what the impetus and rationale behind Readiness 2030 or Rearm Europe is, and what the general reaction has been to EU from EU member states?
Yeah, there's a double rationale at work here. One is the increased threat perception of Russian aggressiveness, of course, but there's also the shock and awe tactics of the Trump administration that, if I summarize, tell the Europeans you might be on your own, certainly when it comes to the conventional defense of Europe. So in a sense, you could say that shock and awe has worked, but in a very dangerous way, because the Trump administration has also hinted that Article 5 may not apply, or not in the way that we told it would apply, and that it may actually help to provoke or increase certain threats. So all of that put together has really pushed the Europeans to, through the European Union, invest massively in their rearmament, and there is a very strong consensus about that throughout the EU, I would say.
Could you maybe describe some of the key pillars of the plan as outlined in the white paper?
I think what's important to know, first of all, is that there is now a wide consensus that the EU's role in collective defense is to facilitate NATO. So the force goals will be set through the NATO defense planning process. But there is a debate ongoing about that, in the sense that the current NDPP assumes that there will be a great American conventional contribution, which the US itself has now said Europe will actually not. So one ought to probably revise the NDPP, and then those renewed targets, meaning that the Europeans would have to have their own strategic enablers, that ought then to serve as guidance for what the EU does. So what does the EU do? It regulates the defense market, tries to promote competition, mobility, market access, and so on and so forth. Then it can lend money to member states at cheaper rates than market rates. It also relaxes the budgetary rules so that if you invest in defense, you don't get in trouble with the Commission for breaking the rules about how large the deficit may be. And finally, the EU itself, from its own budget, will also invest quite massively in the defense industry. So they're basically that facilitating role that should help the EU member states to meet those NATO targets.
What has changed between the US and Europe, and what is driving this pivot in US foreign policy towards Europe? And what is the general consensus within Europe now vis-a-vis the US as a partner, and do Europeans generally see any way back from where we are now?
I mean, what has not changed is that the United States ask Europeans to do more, right? Trump is not the first to say that, far from it. What has changed is the way that he does it. He tries to push us by increasing the danger, by saying, well, I might not actually defend each and every ally in each and every scenario. Remember that at one point he even said that he was almost encouraging Putin to aggress NATO allies that didn't pay their dues, right? I mean, how far-fetched can it be for a US president? And added to that is the fact that Trump is negotiating directly with Putin about Ukraine without inviting even Ukraine itself, let alone its European NATO allies or EU member states. So that is a new factor, of course. What you really feel, I think, is that Trump and his ilk are not interested in Europe. Or if they're interested, it's because they are ideologically against the existence of the European Union as such. And basically, what that proves is that Lord Palmerston was right. We have no eternal friends, we have no eternal enemies. Everybody only has eternal interests. So if you look at it from a long-term historical perspective, it is not that surprising that the Transatlantic Alliance begins to show some cracks. right? You could say the surprising thing is that it lasted so long. It doesn't mean either that it has to disappear, but if you want it to survive, I think we have to reconceptualize NATO as an alliance not between the US and all those individual countries, Canada and all the European countries, but between the US on the one hand and a single European bloc on the other hand. So I think there is now a growing awareness in Europe. Europe needs to be able to ensure its own conventional defense so that in a worst case scenario, we can hold off any conventional aggression without needing a single American. That will not be possible tomorrow, right? This will take at least a decade, but that ought to be the end state. And paradoxically, by being able to defend ourselves without the Americans, we can maybe keep the Americans on board in the alliance.
The defense white paper that came out a few months ago was very much informed by changes in the transatlantic relationship, but it's also informed by other factors as well. Could you touch on maybe how the war in Ukraine altered threat perceptions of European states?
Yeah, I mean, the war in Ukraine in the end is about our own security, right? If you analyze this in a very realpolitik way, seen from Brussels, we support Ukraine not only for Ukraine per se. We support it because if you give Russia the impression that it can win or that it has won, and that we surrender Ukraine, then there will be a next target. Moldova, Georgia, then we lose access to the Caucasus and thus to Central Asia. So if in the end we create the impression that we are totally intimidated, we might even provoke aggression against ourselves. There are clear indications that in Putin's mind, even the Baltic states, which are in the EU and NATO, actually belong in the Russian sphere of influence. So we're doing this to protect our own interest. And so the consequence is that for all intents and purposes, Ukraine, even though it has not joined the EU and NATO, is nevertheless a part of our defensive perimeter. Right? That is where we have to stop the Russians, at the border between Ukraine and Russia, as far to the east as possible. So, I mean, for sure, this awareness was already there in the east of Europe and in Scandinavia, this awareness of the Russian threat. It's now also much more prominent here in Belgium, my country, and where, of course, the EU and NATO are based, in Western Europe. I think maybe in Southern Europe there is still more need to raise awareness.
What capability gaps currently exist in European defense, particularly in terms of helping defend Ukraine, and how might the Rearm plan help ameliorate that? And then from there, what are some of the significant challenges in lifting such a plan off the ground?
The Rearm plan is to a large extent driven by helping Ukraine. So there's two priorities, rearming ourselves, but also continuing to arm Ukraine. And there it's a matter of increasing the defense industrial capacity that we have. That is happening, but it should go much faster. It's also a question of building up Ukraine's own defense industry and massively investing in it, and that is working much better. The thing is, if we want to have an autonomous European pillar within NATO, we need to replace the strategic enablers that so far only the Americans provide. That's intelligence, secure communications, command and control, deep strike and heavy firepower, airlift. So all the big ticket items that are beyond the means of any individual country to provide them. So it's not just a matter of spending more. Part of the additional effort will have to be aligned, will have to be put together by groups of European countries to then collectively acquire the enablers for which until now we're dependent on the United States. And somebody has to take the initiative to do that, right? To say, let's revise the NATO defense planning process. Let's decide which enablers we Europeans need to get ourselves, and let's then take the initiative to develop them, to build them, to procure them, and then that can guide the efforts of the European Commission. By the way, what the EU still has to do is look towards the south, because NATO is looking towards the east, that's deterrence and defense, but Europe also has a very volatile southern flank. And even though the aim is to intervene, militarily speaking, as little as possible, there will be a day when there will be a crisis that demands military action, and that will likely have to be undertaken by the European Union. So preparing a pool of expeditionary forces that can secure our interest in the South, that I think remains a job for the EU's common security and defense policy, while its main other role is to facilitate deterrence and defense through a complete militarily autonomous pillar of NATO.
Next, Rafael Loss, Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, discusses the role Canada can play in strengthening Europe's industrial base, as well as the capability gaps the EU needs to fill. I read a figure that Europe is looking to source approximately 60% or so of its materials and acquisitions within Europe, and that there might be space for countries like Canada or other allies to provide the additional 30 or 40%. Do you see any room for further cooperation or integration between an ally like Canada per se and Europe?
If you follow discussions inside of Europe on where to source defense capability, then there's a sovereigntist camp that would like to invest as much of European tax money in European industry and capabilities, recognizing that, of course, supply chains are global to a large extent by nature, and that also is the case for defense industrial supply chains. And then there's a especially transatlanticist camp that does see the US playing a long-term fruitful role in European defense innovation, in capability generation, and in procurement. And the white paper very much is a compromise between those two camps, one that is a bit more inward-oriented for sourcing material and capability, and the other one a bit more outward-oriented, though not, neglecting the European element of all of this. But we see a strong internal push for greater efficiency and financing, because this is where the EU's capacity is, the added value in these conversations. The EU can change regulation and it has financial firepower. So how can it bring those two factors to the table to boost European defense capability? And then on the external side, how to engage with select partners around the world, those that are like-minded, that have a interest in engaging with the European Union on those conversations, and to collaboratively innovate and build capability. Ukraine is a preferred partner, of course, because it does face the current struggle against continued Russian aggression. Norway is a very natural partner in this, because it is part of many of the regulatory and financial conversations with the EU anyways, even though it's not a member of the EU. The UK is on its way sort of back towards the European Union orbit, importantly also on defense questions. And Canada, of course, not only as a source for raw material resources, but also as a politically very like-minded partner. A partner where I have the impression Canadian diplomats in Europe are currently extremely eager to engage in any conversation that is having a seat at the table, and where Canadian defense spending plans, procurement plans point to a boosting of capability as well, at the same time as they are pointing towards efforts to reduce dependencies on the United States. Of course, my understanding of Canadian policy is that the Canadian government very much recognizes that the US is the big neighbor down south, and that there are dependencies that will remain in the future, and that collaboration does make sense in the future. I think the outreach to the Trump administration on this issue of the Golden Dome air and missile defense architecture is a very sensible one. Canada does already cooperate, of course, with the US on NORAD, and has for a long time. But there are certain multi-vector interests, I think, that point Canada towards the right share of Europe, and European interests that point to Canada.
What kind of challenges and opportunities would you say come with trying to coordinate defense efforts among EU countries, and what considerations might go into choosing which defense projects are pursued jointly at that level?
European governments traditionally have not seen a large role for the European Union in defense matters. They've always prioritized cooperation through the NATO alliance, through its integrated military command structure and political processes. And that means that this current EU Commission, as led by Ursula von der Leyen, rightly sees itself as a service provider to these kinds of member state and NATO-led efforts. There are also attempts to improve cooperation between NATO and the European Union as two organizations. Traditionally, they've struggled a lot, even sharing information between the two, due to political caveats and vetoes attached by individual allies or member states. But the EU does recognize that it has certain competencies. I've mentioned regulation, incentives, and financial firepower already. And that means that the EU can shape the European defense market. It can create incentives for innovation, for joint research development and procurement. And that is certainly where the white paper is looking for instruments such as the SAFE 150 billion loan scheme that it's tried to develop, where it would provide member states financing for joint projects. It's also proposed to lift or modify the Stability and Growth Pact to exempt defense spending from some of those limitations on excessive government deficits and debt. And the Commission hopes to mobilize about 650 billion from that. I think the 800 total figure is a bit too optimistic, but it points to the EU's ability to sort of shape these incentives and regulations in order to mobilize more money and to set the structures right for member states to spend it more efficiently, to generate greater interchangeability between technologies, when you look at munitions, for example, and to enhance interoperability. European capability gaps are one of the priority areas that the white paper is looking at. The single market for defense is another one. And then this issue of European readiness, because as a result of donating so much equipment to Ukraine, European stockpiles are running low, and refilling them will take a lot of effort from individual member states, but also the European Union as a contributor to those efforts.
To close out this week's podcast, we spoke with Jean-Pierre Maulny, Deputy Director of the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. Maulny is going to speak about coherence among member states in regards to defense industrial base integration through Rearm Europe, as well as France's perspective on EU defense and strategic autonomy. As you'll well know, in 2017, President Macron called for a stronger role for Europeans in European defense, this notion of strategic autonomy. And that at the time sparked controversy. As you'll recall, the German defense minister sort of rebuked him and made it quite clear that she felt there was only one backbone for EU security, that being the United States. Now, a lot has happened since 2017. How is the notion perceived now among some of the member states, and where does France see itself in positionally within European defense?
Your question is very interesting because I think there are a lot of misunderstanding of this subject. We can say that, in fact, the man who push for more European strategic autonomy is Donald Trump. Because it's not a question of strategic autonomy. It's a question that EU member states, European countries, have to spend more for their security. And in fact, France says the same thing. What is not new, but perhaps we push more today on this subject. It is the fact that the reinforcement of European security, of the security of the Europe, with the European policy, member states' policy to spend more on defense. But this question, it is at the level of the EU, but also at the level of NATO. The view in France today is that we need, in fact, more coordination between NATO and EU. And so it's not the old view of some EU countries on France, which was not the reality, that France want to push European defense against NATO. It's totally not the case to them. It is the contrary. We are pushing, in fact, to push European members, to push European countries, to do more within NATO. And simply, it is at the end, it is the question of the security of Europe. Saying that to do more on the security of Europe, it's also the question to be able to deploy some capabilities that today we are not able to do without the support of the United States. If the United States shift all their security on the Asian area, and specifically their military capabilities, at one moment it will ask for United States simply to sell some armaments to European unions. They will say, okay, on the principle, but it is not our priority. The priority is to reinforce the ASEAN the ASEAN theater, and not the European theater. So, for example, today, we have launched at the level of some EU countries, some clusters, for example, to develop capability to build deep strike capabilities, because deep strike capabilities, for example, HIMARS, it's only the United States we are able to build this type of capabilities. So at what moment we need simply to develop this type of capabilities in Europe. So is it strategic autonomy or not strategic autonomy? At the moment, it's not the question. The question is the security of Europe. And we have to do more, also in terms of building military capabilities with the European defense and technological base in order to guarantee our security. So I think the question of strategic autonomy, it's no more a question today in European Union, and perhaps for France, but it's not new. The objective is sometimes not to use the term of strategic autonomy, but simply to be able to reinforce the security of Europe with European military capabilities. The first thing today is to have more coordinated and shared view of all the members of NATO on the question of the role of the US in the security of Europe. We have to have a shared view on the situation, and so a shared policy on our security. And that explains also that in the plan Rearm Europe, there is a step in the direction of third countries and even non-European third countries like Canada. So it is sure that this situation, it changed really the strategic landscape. So I was recently in a meeting in France at the Ministry of Defense, and there are two questions. The first question for the European countries is to have a credible speech to the United States, to Donald Trump, to say, okay, we will do more collectively for the security of Europe. And to do more collectively for the security of Europe, it's all the European countries first. And the second thing is that, of course, we have to share the same view and to have a more common policy at the level of the European countries in order to strengthen the security of Europe. And it's not totally linked so to the European countries, but another time to all the members of NATO to have a common view and a common way to give an answer to the United States and to Donald Trump.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday and Thursday, but we'll be taking a bit of a break this summer and releasing one podcast a week. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.